Okay, well, good afternoon and welcome everybody to the History Seminar Series. This is our second seminar for Term 2. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm joining you today, as many of us are, from unceded Bedegal country here in Sydney, and to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. It is my great pleasure today to welcome Dr. Rachel Goldlust. Rachel completed her PhD at La Trobe University in 2020, having traced the history of self-sufficient living in Australia from the late 19th century. Her thesis was a social and environmental history of the ongoing attraction of urban dwellers to connect with the land by going off-grid. Prior to commencing her PhD, Rachel undertook a master's in social sciences from RMIT University in Melbourne, with a focus on sustainable planning. She then worked as a municipal town planner and taught environmental education, particularly looking at passive solar design and better suited housing for Australian climes. Rachel is currently looking to combine her interests through postdoctoral research on an environmental history of Australian housing. And it is this research, I believe, that she will be sharing with us today. She is passionate about oral history, environmental and social justice, building design, travel, storytelling, and bringing sustainable living ideas to wider audiences through her work and writing. And so without any further ado, I will hand the floor to you, Rachel, and please feel free to share your screen.
All right. Thank you, Steve and colleagues at the UNSW History Department. I am very honoured to be invited into your seminar series and to be presenting to you today. I hope there's not too much technical issues or background noise, but please let me know if there is. I want to acknowledge that I am normally presenting from the unceded country of the Dja Dja Wurrung people in central Victoria. And I want to acknowledge that their sovereignty was never ceded. And I am zooming in today from Indonesia at the expense and the potentially erratic Wi-Fi of the good people of Bali. So I think everyone's come here today for the same reason, because everyone's got something to say about housing. As I have watched and read report after report in the past few weeks discussing the state of buying, renting, or providing housing for our most vulnerable, I despair at the rhetorical versus the reality of housing in contemporary Australia, and which has been a feature of much of the last generation. My provisional title for this talk was Why Australian Housing is, choose your expletive, a historical and environmental overview, but I was graciously talked out of it. This sentiment, though, does express the core of my positioning on the subject. Whether you've got it, nearly got it, got evicted from it, got it and wish you could just update the bathroom, or trying to get it to solidify your portfolio, there is something universal and yet incredibly challenging about housing. Our fair leaders have been talking about it for the last couple of months, and indeed they'll probably keep just talking about it until we hear from them again in 3 years' time. Far be it from me, an environmental historian who has most recently been studying the alternative political and social frameworks of hippies, hermits, and other back to the landers, to be the one to weigh in on the current housing debate. Thus, I'm not going to talk about that. As I am new to housing scholarship, this talk is a tentative toe dip, a survey of the historiography that I could put my hands on, an introduction to one case study, and an opportunity to conceive of a larger project that looks at housing as if the environment matters. This repositioning of housing as an issue of justice, not only for all of our citizens, but taking into account land, native ecosystems, and other creatures, could help reduce our already heavy carbon footprint, improve our living conditions and quality of life, provide greater justice for housing and equality, and has yet to be tackled meaningfully in Australia and only nominally internationally. Although this talk is largely focused on Australia, I chose this image of Hundertwasser's Kunsthaus in Vienna as more than just a nice introductory backdrop. I put it here to illustrate the potential of incorporating nature in design beyond the aesthetic, as Hundertwasser's famously eccentric approach to design saw greenery as an entry point to a broader consciousness around ecology and sustainability. Of this building, Hundertwasser said in 1991, the greenery becomes tree tenants. And he claimed that tree tenants are the ambassadors of the free forests in the city. The tree tenant is a giver, a piece of nature which can develop without the rationalist control of man and his technology. But much like the Guggenheims and other examples of radical architecture, though he did give trees agency, such conception is viewed as an oddity, an iconic political art statement, rather than as a legitimate challenge to the way most of us think about building and how our housing imagines its responsibility and duty to the immediate and broader surrounding. The feeling that our homes are problematic carbon black holes is now provable and widely accepted. Residential buildings are responsible for 24% of overall electricity use and 12% of total carbon emissions in Australia. One recent report from the EPA declared about 8 million homes contribute between 18 and 20% of Australia's carbon emissions. Our homes are net energy consumers and have only recently become producers through the widespread uptake of solar panels. Much of the sustainability literature and ideas shaping local government policies focus on individual household energy use within the commitment towards net zero emissions, which remains a largely abstract plan, but equates to roughly 50% reduction in emissions per person over the next dozen years. Overall, the construction, operation, and maintenance of buildings accounts for almost a quarter of greenhouse gas emissions in Australia. While the design and construction of shelter, much like the production of food and fuel, has always had considerable environmental costs, housing is also a deeply personal, cultural, spiritual, and political topic that can be approached from several angles. Houses are simultaneously architectures of past thought, ethnographical insights, and artistic or design experiments. As theoretician Roderick Lawrence wrote in 1985, at the height of investigations into, quote, domestic environments, one way of approaching housing is to look at them as dynamic confluences of people, places, and psychological processes. Across the literature, which is vast, houses are also seen as a convergence of people, practices, and policies, and in recent years have started to be assessed as a function of culture, gender, and the environment. But while gender and domesticity, ideas of home and family have been a keen area of study since the 1990s, there's been less work undertaken on sustainable design and environmental thinking and practice. Architectural historians are coming to terms with the gaps in discourse surrounding the environment. One article recently argued that the term environment becomes a space of discursive elaboration as an inquiry into the relationship between economies and ecologies and a desire to act upon that relationship, to ameliorate it both to the benefit of humans or some segment of the human population and or to the benefit of animal species, of plant life, of geographical and biophysical conditions. It is in this space that there has been growing research into some citizen-led environmental reform efforts, the environmental implications of various urban infrastructures and waste management practices. Such largely interdisciplinary research has also touched on the profound ways that both cities and nature shape urban environments and the environmental significance of city-country relationships. So I look forward to questions, points of order, and suggestions, as this is a new and experimental project for me, and I'm very open, and there will be plenty of time at the end for people to give me suggestions or interpretations of where they think I could and should take this project. So coming out of my master's in urban planning over 10 years ago now, I was trained to see housing through the lens of city planners, landscape architects, and public health officials as the great designers of urban environments. Though I did graduate in a subcategory of environmental planning, I've long felt that while green belts and cohesive waste and development goals are critical to managing urban sprawl, there was actually very little of the environment in houses themselves. Not long after my master's degree in 2009, I traveled to New Mexico to learn how to build Earthships. These are a type of self-sufficient house based on a series of sustainability principles that seek to challenge fundamental paradigms of shelter, labor, and community, while addressing the issue of basic needs. I was later drawn to housing once again during my PhD as I wrote about modernism, environmentalism, and the rise of post-war earth building in Australia as a way of critically challenging the precepts of industrialisation and suburban development, and which is the case study that I will return to shortly. So to give some context for my study into earth houses, as one of the most abundant forms of vernacular housing, earth building integrates natural systems, climatic conditions, landscapes, and weather patterns. Vernacular here refers to local or regional construction that uses materials and resources from the area where the building is located. Vernacular is, quote, built to meet specific needs, accommodate the values, economy, and lifestyles of a specific culture. It is estimated that between a third and a half of the world's population live in buildings constructed of earth. The most common material is mud, which has been used in a variety of building techniques such as cob, piece de terre, and adobe since the humans first began creating shelter 10, 20, 30, 40,000 years ago. It also extends to thatch, stone, wattle and daub, straw, and timber. Over the centuries, Indigenous forms of earth shelter have developed on every continent and have been the basis of most successful civilizations. Bruce Pascoe has noted that across Australia, permanent housing was a feature of pre-contact Aboriginal economy, observable from, quote, the far Kimberley to Cape York, from the Hutt River to Tasmania, from Brewarrina to Hamilton. The misapprehension, Pascoe claims, was when Europeans came upon houses built to accommodate 40 people and resorted to words such as huts or hovels to describe buildings that in rural Ireland would have been called croft houses. Following Paul Memmett's groundbreaking book, Gunya, Gundi and Worley, The Indigenous Architecture of Australia from 2007, there has been some recognition of Indigenous buildings on the bush architecture of early Australian settlement. The pervasive narrative has been that across the Americas and New Zealand, early settlers largely adapted European technologies to suit local environments. By the 1890s, these techniques fell out of fashion, widely perceived as primitive and counter to a modernizing nation building with brick and steel to better serve its progressive vision. Graham Davison argues that any history of Australian housing must consider the formative relationship between homeland dreams and the character of the colonial house. So as Australia moved through federation, it came up with federation housing that included symbols of flora and fauna embedded in the timberwork as a celebration of the new nation. A quick Google search revealed one story that relayed, as architects and builders fused influences from France, Britain, and America, they created a uniquely Australian style, less formal than its Victorian predecessors and far better suited to the country's subtropical climate. But I ask, was this a significant shift in the colonial paradigm regarding how we build and where we site our houses? A brief look at the historiography suggests that vernacular design did begin with the arts and crafts movement, famously inspired by the design ethos of Frank Lloyd Wright, embraced by the likes of Walter Burley Griffin, and spearheaded by local architects such as Walter Butler and Rodney Alsop. While the arts and crafters were the first to conceive of the house and land as one entity, extending to regard a street or suburb as an ecosystem working in harmony, the houses themselves did not fundamentally challenge the building or siting in reference to the particulars of climate and or season. That is, unless you believe that the quote, rough cut walls, lots of windows, and an attention to landscaping, typical of arts and craft houses, will keep you warm in winter and cooler in summer. Early modernist housing was radical in that it was a new design born out of the so-called new continent that simplified architecture, garden layouts, and suburban planning, which was in line with international architects such as Le Corbusier and increasingly lent itself to cleanliness, space, and efficiency, but engaged less observation of existing topography, climate, and seasons. In a recent article by architectural historians from the University of Sydney, they explain that an environmental history of architecture means reframing how issues we now identify as environmental have played a role in the production of buildings and in the production of the subjects that inhabit them. In the quote, diagrams, drawings, buildings, and speculative work that we gather under the term architecture. This analysis, though, does not belie the biases towards southern and predominantly urban architecture. A less metropole-centric view might then argue that Queenslanders, the infamous housing style favoured across the tropics, was one of the most successful modern vernacular housing styles to pay significant respects to the particulars of climate, season, prevailing breezes, and the reality of flooding in its design. The Queenslander was developed to respond to the humidity and heat of Northern Australian summer. And a recently reimagined Queenslander won the House of the Year at the Australian Institute of Architects Regional Architecture Award for its sustainability principles and sympathy with the landscape. The Garden City movement of the 1920s saw the ideal of the detached single-storey home surrounded by one's property as the ultimate counter to the degenerative and salubrious tenements of inner city life. Here is a photo of Yallourn, the State Electricity Commission built town that was designed with close adherence to the tenets of the Garden City ideal. But as planning historian Robert Freestone has observed, the socio-ideology of the planned garden suburb was deeply conservative. Katie Holmes has also commented that within the Australian suburban garden ideal, in both front and back, order and control over the environment was sought, the appearance of the landscape changed, and the history of its acquisition was both erased and celebrated. Building on my research on those who consciously rejected much of the ideology of suburbanism and urban aspirations, I have found a marginal but enduring narrative of those who built with other ideas in mind, and often that was the environment. Historian Meredith Fletcher has argued that to reach beyond the quarter-acre block and the urban frontier is often maligned, but points out that alternative forms, such as earth homes, can become documents to elucidate why people make a home in the bush. Indeed, it has widely been held that it wasn't until the 1960s, with the creation of the Bush Schools movement of landscape designers and gardeners in Melbourne and Sydney, that native landscapes and constructions that sat in harmony with the immediate environment was reimagined. Much of the scholarship, which is largely drawn from North America, has located the origins of the alternative housing movement, not with native civilizations, but with the systems philosopher Buckminster Fuller, whose geodesic domes challenge the constructs of domiciles. Fuller, who's a bit of a cult legend these days, expressed the need for mankind to use teamwork to fully utilize Earth's limited resources. Fuller's technological designs captured the imagination of the counterculture of the 1970s. His domes, considered the most daring of avant-garde designs, carried a message of democratic participation and a forewarning of environmental collapse. Writing in 1963, Fuller warned 1/3 of the human family is now doomed to premature death due to causes arising directly from inadequate solution to the housing problem, and pointed to dramatic increases in population and energy consumption. Some Australians were aware of Fuller's calls, but a more mainstream forewarning didn't come until the 1970s, and even then was directed towards failures in policy rather than any consideration of what impact our housing was having on the immediate and broader environment. In 1974, Hugh Stretton, then Professor of History at the University of Adelaide and Deputy Chair of the South Australian Housing Trust, delivered 5 lectures on housing and government for the Boyer Lecture Series. Stretton's lectures viewed housing as an issue of class, but saw no issue with the types of houses that Australians were living in following the long boom of the post-war reconstruction, except to ensure that the Australian dream was sustained as a strong underpinning of a growing economy and immigration policy. In one of his lectures, Stretton did make a link between housing and urban and environmental concerns. While suburbanisation was the best way to deliver a high quota and standard of housing to the greatest number of people, Stretton warned against densification, as suburbanisation was not the problem, but how Australians used their homes was what posed an environmental threat. Stretton said, "Do generous houses and gardens themselves hurt the environment? They can if people fill their houses and gardens with machinery and drench them with chemicals and build them too far away from the places where their people work, in oversized cities that generate too much daily travel. On the other hand, generous housing with land around it offers the best scope for good environmental behaviour. It's in houses with storage space and some land around it that it's easiest to collect local energy or to use more human energy and to get along with less powered commercial services. It's also easier to adapt to many kinds of environmental and industrial breakdown. Stretton's assessment, taking into account the siting, relationship, and energy components of housing, was a sound forewarning of the types of discussions that were going to entangle the humble house for the next decade and generation, and a conversation that had previously been largely assessed as a symbol of identity, a product of a collective vision, and a critical feature and tool of colonial expansion. So, in a roundabout way, I've returned to my initial question. What does building with an eye to the environment mean? How have Australians been doing it, and with relative degrees of success? And what are the possible outcomes? Through an environmental history lens, housing until now has largely been assessed as a function of systems design. So in their relationship to utilities, as a metric for disasters and pollution, and as a unit for classification, i.e. suburban planning. In her introduction to a Cities, Nature and Justice Symposium held at UTS in 2008, Heather Goodall argued that rarely are these three terms considered together. Cities, she claimed, are where entanglements of the social and cultural with the scientific and technological happen, recognizing that nature happens in cities alongside the built environment. Environmentally, it has thus made sense to isolate cities from everywhere else and look at the inputs and outputs of a city as the benchmark for systems thinking. The city is thus conceived of as a biological entity, and the scale of examination related to materiality are often channeled this way. Considering housing histories tend to look at the social and cultural aspects of suburbs, cities, or housing styles, environmental history is left to pick up the rest. Though environmental historian Ruth Morgan has conceded that, quote, the discourse of environmental history often overlooks and undervalues domestic and urban environments, even though most Australians reside in suburban areas. To scale up such a question, cities are considered environmental vectors and can be expounded upon as you look at bigger and bigger geographical scales, looking to that of country and then empire. Patrick Troy's celebrated 2000 collection, A History of European Housing, is fairly clear in its framing. We have transported the dreams and designs of European houses, much like our approach to agriculture, planning, art, and other conventions from Europe. This approach has resulted in a bloated and ill-suited stock of housing that is moving us further and further away from the early visions of vernacular housing, homes made of the landscape, and puts us at an increasing disadvantage when we think about adaptation and mitigation for changing environmental conditions, climate change, and the much beloved Australian dream of home ownership. In her review of Troy's book, environmental historian Andrea Gaynor concedes that as a historiography, it does go beyond bricks and mortar to questions of community, individualism, and equality. Indeed, Troy notes in the introduction, the perspectives presented in the book seek to open a kind of conversation which might stimulate further thinking about the homes Australians have made. What I didn't realise, and which I discovered in Gaynor's review, is that Troy's book was a collaboration of 18 authors and was one of the main outputs of the Urban and Environmental Program at the ANU, which was sadly closed in 1999. Such centres, Gaynor mused, saw the value in interdisciplinary studies of urban and environmental research. So it was from this entry point into housing that I started to look at architectural histories, mostly from the 1960s to the 1980s, and found an oft-repeated narrative of how housing has evolved through white settlement. Australia's search for vernacular housing emerged through federation as part of the search for a distinctly Australian culture. The question of what might compose an Australian architecture was widely agreed to be climate, in faint recognition after 120 years that Australia was more varied in temperature, seasonal variations, and chill factors to Europe. The narrative follows that it is with this understanding the first generation of Australian architects turned to America, whose material and industrial development they admired, and they shared a language of development and experimentation. But while America provided an exciting new palette for embarking on a distinct style, federated Australians still clung to the English arts and craft movement and the European Art Nouveau. It is here that I want to introduce my case study, and that considers a different approach to European housing in the immediate post-World War II period, and which has since evolved into what we now call environmental or natural building. So it's between 1911 and 1947 that Australia's urban population had doubled, with a large proportion centred on the outskirts of major cities. Providing the vanguard of what Mike Berry has termed the home-owning democracy, prosperity, equity, and independence were no longer associated with a rural selection, but now largely equated with a quarter-acre block in the suburbs. Faced with a looming housing shortage of 300,000 in the immediate post-war years, emergent government science recognised the practical benefits of rationalising housing, house building and design. This came at a time of Jindy Warabak and a new generation of artisans who looked to connect with the landscape and natural features as part of a modern, yet simple, yet politically and culturally attuned form of citizenship. Born out of a nascent bohemian antipathy to suburbia, a new avant-garde of young urban intellectuals began to question the structures of capitalism through the lens of Australian liberalism, with an eye to the romantic bush traditions of an unspoilt rural life. As the magnitude of the looming shortage became clear, a group of architects established a small house bureau consisting of state-based services to reinvigorate the housing landscape. In Victoria, the director of the RVIA Small Home Service was the celebrated modernist architect Robin Boyd. Boyd wanted Australians to join him on the high ground of good taste, epitomised by architect-designed modern homes. While the average city dweller should not attempt to plan their dream home, Boyd supported the notion that they should build it themselves. Strongly opposed to prefabricated materials, Boyd penned a weekly column in The Age that began to feature a young draftsman experimenting with earth. In his column, Boyd acknowledged the long history of earthen homes across Australia and conceded that although its popularity had faded following the rise of imported materials and machinery, it had not completely disappeared. So having taken up free tertiary training provided to ex-servicemen, Alastair Knox, who was then 34, enrolled in a building course at RMIT in Melbourne in 1946, probably not far from the same building course that I did. There he connected with the city-based new art movement. He followed these artists out to Montrevat, 25 kilometres from the city on the bushy outskirts of the suburbs. Deeply impressed by the architecture, practices and core attitudes of the Montrevat artists, Knox started building with mud from the shallow clay-rich hills and tapped into ready labour congregating in the area. The labour was made up of city escapees who shared a similar left-wing and intellectual orientation. And Knox started designing homes that reflected both the individual values of their inhabitants and the landscape on which they were being built. Some might recognise some of the names from these two pictures here, that being Gordon Ford particularly, and Betty and Tim Burstall, who were both celebrated Melbourne artists and identities. By the late 1940s, Knox's growing number of projects were challenging the perceptions that earth couldn't be included in Boyd's modernist enterprise. For many working class owner builders, earth construction became practicable, with newspapers across Western Australia, Queensland and New South Wales reporting that earth houses were comparable in comfort and appearance with any kind of modern construction. With reference to a characteristic prejudice of local housing authorities towards unorthodox materials and styles, these articles began to reframe the concept of earth building in light of the expanding modernist campaign geared towards stylish, logical, and rational housing that should be responsive to its surroundings. As earth building gained greater credibility and shed both its colonial and pre-colonial associations, a range of publications began promoting the practice on and off the farm. Its egalitarian everyman appeal tapped into a looming fear of declining masculinity in the rapidly changing post-war society. Earth building conformed with the new phenomenon of DIY building and expressions of post-war masculinity. It promoted the physical prowess, efficiency, and rationality, often entangled with the pioneer legend, and proved its economic suitability and flexibility as it could be done by hand or with the assistance of machines to mechanize part of the process. The credibility of earth building had been given a boost by the dedicated work of a government engineer, originally from England, George Middleton, who was put at the helm of a new agency called the Commonwealth Experimental Building Station in North Ryde in Sydney. The station's mandate was to carry out experimental construction in different climatic and geographical locations. And engineers, builders, architects, and the public welcomed this as an innovative scientific approach to housing design and the recognition of the relationship between climate and house design across the nation's varied and extreme weather and seasonal conditions. Middleton's guide, Build Your House of Earth, one here on the left, originally published in 1953, is still available and in an updated form and is considered the Bible of rammed earth building across Australia's many climates. While Robin Boyd sought to provide cost-effective and stylish homes without shattering the conservative suburban dream, Earth Homes came to embody a progressive position regarding capitalism and growth, and by the 1960s had begun to digress from the modernist agenda. In 1975, Knox published Living in the Environment, in which he challenged the relationship between progress, modernity, labor, and the natural world through the prism of design. Knox argued earth building was a suitable response to the problematic aspects of modernity, technology, and consumption, with the home being transformed as a symbolic alternative against conventional suburban domesticity. Knox opposed the basic properties and principles of suburban development, which sought as a basis distinction from its surroundings by first clearing the site, then building from manufactured or prefabricated materials, and replanting the garden with imported or non-local species. He was highly critical of builders who removed vegetation in the process of constructing homes and sheds in rural and urban areas. This pattern of development, he saw, represented a persistent fear that sought to tame, control, and eradicate native features in an attempt to replicate the suburban dream in rural areas. Knox's books emerged at a time when earth building was having a second renaissance by the 1970s that saw a dramatic increase in domestic publications focused on new forms of ecological design that would reflect a genuinely Australian architecture based on lifestyle. In his article on autonomous architecture of the Rainbow region, University of Sydney academic Lee Stickles has argued that developing histories of countercultural architecture means adopting a different kind of historical focus. In broadening the topic to include more experimental forms of house design and material use, we can engage with the social relations, but also the environmental concerns that are embedded in the production and meaning of buildings or houses. So it continues to evolve and professionalize, but earth building remains a rational, though fairly bespoke housing style. The practical act of building one's own home from local materials continues to challenge aspects of modernity as it reframes ideas of control, professionalism, and the use of industrial materials and supply chains, while also engendering a certain sympathy with and understanding of the native landscape, the seasons, and the climate. In what Tony Dingle and Seamus O'Hanlon have hailed as the contested space of modernism and domesticity in post-war Australia, Knox brought the domestic to the natural world and encouraged more thoughtful ways to live in it through the practical, human, emotional, and in his words, truly aesthetic value of building with earth. Much like the modernist agenda to bring light into our homes, earth buildings emphasize siting, orientation, and airflow, all essential passive solar principles that also encourages the use of local materials. These ideas have now found their way into many environmental planning controls and energy assessments for new and renovated housing, and is now considered best practice when looking at maximum star ratings, far exceeding the contribution of much of the brick, steel, concrete, and timber homes that have made up much of suburban and rural development over the last 25 years. Sadly, these controls are often easy to subvert or work around as builders and developers try to gain as much advantage as possible in new estates and housing complexes. So I'm sure I'm not the only one who has a notable cringe when I drive through these new estates and developments. This is not just an urbane snobbery in looking at their poor aesthetic appeal, uniformity, and seemingly empty streets devoid of soul and culture. I see those buildings, recognizing their importance, their critical importance, as we strive to continue to provide adequate, safe, and comfortable housing with access to schools, jobs, and commerce for all Australians. I see them as horrific environmental disasters, each one taking us backwards in our attempt to decarbonise and minimise the inputs of the fossil fuel industry. We can't continue to build oversized, badly designed, poor quality, and wrongly suited houses in different parts of the country, bung a few solar panels on and call it good. At the very least, our historical hubris as bringing European designs and then adding on some greenery shows an ongoing lack of understanding of our particular climate, seasonal shifts, and the fundamentals of physics, as we wonder why our homes remain horrifically hot and dangerously cold throughout the year. I read an article on the ABC just the other day by Philip Oldfield, head of the UNSW School of the Built Environment. He was writing in response to the recent Arctic blast that I'm very graciously escaping right now. And it read that Australian homes are closer to tents, the title was, Australian homes are closer to tents than insulated eco-buildings. Oldfield's call was for national building standards to be overhauled to fight climate change and energy poverty. He notes that it wasn't until the 1990s that insulation standards were introduced, and we have long lagged behind Europe when it comes to double glazing and implementing the basic thermal physics of insulation. The argument is increasingly being made that the worse our homes perform, the more Australians will spend on energy bills, which creates deeper divisions and greater poverty as fossil fuels prices soar and the national energy market and the way that the national energy market is constructed means that the government must continue to buffer us from its extremes. A $250 energy concession that I received after 2020 doesn't really go very far when the fundamentals of the house is much like the fuel guzzling cars of the 1970s and is primed for energy consumption. So I'm going to finish up. In his assessment of landscape, Thomas Dunlap has argued that settlement and its impact on nature is an ongoing process dependent on both natural and mental processes. The progressive conquest of empire was premised on ideas of individual opportunity, the application of practical knowledge to create wealth, and an idea of being both Western and native at once. Dunlap calls it the political organisation of home, where settlement facilitated the transformation of dreams into landed realities, and each generation remakes their own dynamic relationship to technology, nature, and constructs of home. It is a story, he says, of ambiguity, destruction, and displacement. And this needs to be the place to begin an environmental history of Australian housing. So I hope that through this presentation, we can begin to shift our view from justice, meaning the ability of Australians to secure safe and affordable housing, to include better design, to not just build bulldozer style, but recognise that housing that mimics the landscape will ultimately be better to live in, better for the environment, and more resilient in the face of ongoing climate change. I hope that I can grow this project to take in the varieties of housing styles across the country and take in different historical case studies that take into account Indigenous methods and rationalities, and recognise the role of localised materials, cyclic energy systems, and scale as fundamental for us to live more in harmony with the land in which we find ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Can everyone join me in giving Rachel a round of applause, whether with your hands or your...
I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Rachel.